Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Gameweek 18 cheat sheet. I'm recording this video before Fulham versus Nottingham Forest has been played, so that is a small caveat to the video. Although just looking at the fixture itself, I do think Wilson and Anderson are extremely highly owned picks that are quite popular, but their injuries probably won't dramatically change how we apply using free transfers going forward. It's more than likely that they can be replaced by like-for-like picks, whereas obviously the Bruno injury is pretty dramatic. The Isak injury and the confirmation of the length of that injury, I do think changes the FPL landscape quite a bit. So we have the Bruno injury, and it seems like Amram has said that he could be a couple of games out. I think he seemed a bit pessimistic about the injury, so a couple games out is actually a lot from an FPL point of view, because if you're just thinking about timelines, if let's say Bruno's out for maybe at least 2 weeks, you're probably missing 3 to 4 fixtures at the bare minimum, and a few games in that context is probably that 3 to 4 and maybe even 5. So the tricky thing with United's fixtures is that their fixture run is now. Their fixture run effectively almost ends when they have Arsenal and City. So I feel like Bruno missing these short runs of games will actually just mean that he might not be a buyback until something like Gameweek 23 or 24. Whereas, let's say, if we were to go back to Isak's injury as well, I do think that dramatically kind of shifts a couple of picks, right? I think that makes Ekitike just inherently more appealing. That just means more minutes for Ekitike going forwards. It probably also means Ekitike is going to see out more games than you actually expected. You know, part of why Ekitike's minutes this season have not been perfect is because Isak has been around, and also Slot has not wanted to run him into the ground. But I think, unfortunately, with the sort of injuries that they have, he kind of will have to be. Sure, they could find sort of false nine type substitutions for him, like Chiesa, and that's happened before. But I would imagine that this is sort of the run where Ekitike gets to be put to the test from a minutes perspective, and I think that's very intriguing for him. On top of that, I think that still makes some picks in FPL quite good, like even Sobo. The length of the Isak injury kind of improves Sobo as a pick, regardless of whether the fullback injuries for Liverpool have kind of stopped Sobo from being an appetizing pick. Even though he plays right back now, you're basically saying that Sobo is likely going to have 100% pen share up until Salah comes back from AFCON, which is quite a few game weeks, to be honest. And actually still includes a couple of good fixtures, and even potentially a good Burnley fixture as well, depending on, let's say, the length of Salah's absence in AFCON and Egypt's run. So that's kind of interesting context for Sobo. We also know, even let's say if Salah was to come back, I'm not sure 100% he would be nailed back in the team, but it seems like things have been sort of fixed, although the January window can kind of change things going forward. So those are the couple of macro shifts that I think I wanted to start the video off with. Let's just jump into the cheat sheet. If you've never seen the cheat sheet series before, it's effectively a tier list of players in FPL based on sort of my understanding of minutes, my sort of view of, let's say, the underlying stats, including some of the DEFCON numbers, which are all coming from Fantasy Football Hub. They have a great Christmas offer right now where if you sign up during this Christmas period and you don't get a rank rise by the 7th of January, I believe, or the 6th of January, you will actually get 1 free year off with your membership. So have a look at that deal. There's a lot of pro tools available, like the OptiStats tool that I mentioned, and a multitude of other planning tools, including, let's say, the AI team rating and the sort of projected points model, which gives you almost that sort of long form view of how to actually apply your transfers in FPL. To go back to the cheat sheet very briefly, starting with the midfield position, Miley's been added, Weaver's been dropped. Part of this, I think, is Brighton are actually going to enter into a period where they actually have midweek fixtures. And what I'm starting to see is something that I don't like, right? Where with performances being poor in certain matches, you're starting to see Fabian Herzog rotate the team a bit more. Weaver was subject to this. I do apologize for obviously giving Weaver a rise in the previous video. I was feeling pretty confident in his minutes, but then suddenly, of course, you see a poor performance versus Sunderland, and then Weaver is the casualty there. Not only him, but someone like Minte got a 71-minute substitution. And I do feel like with slightly more depth coming back into the team, the issue is if, let's say, they play poorly within another match over this period where everyone's kind of run into the ground anyways, that you're still going to see these early substitutions for some of the Brighton players. And that's kind of my concern. So that's why a lot of the Brighton picks here aren't getting a glow up. Rutter actually has played perfect minutes, but his underlying stats this season have been pretty horrendous. So whilst I actually do like Jorginho as a player, and obviously started the season with him as well, and his minutes have been perfect, I just can't really sanction going for such a boring pick. And it's not like, for example, he's setting the world alight in a different way, right? So, for example, Rodgers doesn't have great underlying stats, but has he just simply scored a ton of chances and shown that he's potentially the best long shot taker in the league? Yeah, I think that's a fair point to make. And the only thing that's a detriment to Rodgers is the next two games are very, very tough. Chelsea away and Arsenal away, I think indisputably are tough, and that's why you won't see changes there. But to go back to that budget tier, Miley is the pick that I quite like. Just because with the Livramento injury, sort of with him being out up until 2026, and it seems like maybe for a while longer than that, right? Because obviously 2026 is around the corner. Him playing at right back, I think, is a pretty big plus. I don't think the DEFCON numbers are that great, although playing at right back, we've seen from Weaver that you can benefit a lot from getting the recoveries as a fullback. And he was able to do that because I think the way that Chelsea were playing specifically within that match was effectively just an outlet ball to Garnacho and see what he can do one-on-one more often than not. So that's why I think Miley was engaged in so many duels. But I do question whether his DEFCON numbers can actually sort of flock up as much as you'd expect, for example, like a Weaver, because so far his numbers, more so operating from a midfield position, are not that amazing. So for me, he's actually just here exclusively because people just want to have a cheap pick. Some of the other West Ham midfielders, to be fair, could also be in the budget categories. So we're talking about Mateus Fernandes and also Potts. But I still think that I probably wouldn't touch them for now because I don't think the DEFCON numbers are good enough from Potts specifically. And then actually with Mateus Fernandes, I still think his open play numbers are not that great compared to some of the options that we have. And it's not like he has, dramatic set piece share or something like that. But if Paqueta's minutes were suddenly to become much worse, I think things can change in FPL. And I would like to see if that's a trend that maybe we'll see going forwards with this West Ham team before I kind of like make changes on the cheat sheet. But yeah, I think this week I would say Stack and Lefay are still my favorite picks, mostly because Lefay's underlying stats are starting to tick up a little bit. And I think with the sort of lack of depth with the Sunderland team, you almost guarantee his minutes over this period. With someone like Stack, we just saw that free kick goal. I mean, I have always been sort of against Stack because I was not sure about his minutes. I think over this period, it seems like his minutes will be pretty nailed, and I think that's what held him together for me last week and deserving a rise. It's not like his DEFCON numbers have been brilliant because they simply haven't been. But once again, when he has set piece share and he has the sort of ability to do well, with Leeds actually promising and delivering a lot on attack compared to, let's say, some of the other promoted sides. So when you look at a team like Sunderland, for example, I think, as I've said many times in videos, they're more impressive on defense. But where Leeds have, I think, been very impressive for a promoted team within the last 2 years is their attacking numbers. We haven't really seen that sort of quality in recent years, to be honest. And yes, they kind of set pieced up Crystal Palace, and that's not going to happen every week. But you've seen also some of the tough matches that they've been able to face last few weeks, and they've been able to score versus teams like Chelsea very convincingly, City, and even Liverpool. So just overall impressive, and to have a piece of that pie with Stack, I think, is hugely beneficial. Granit Xhaka and Anderson I still like, but I don't love so much, mostly because I think Granit's numbers for DEFCON are still not tippity top, and compared to, let's say, Lefay, who's a penalty taker, I think there's sort of average expectations of returns, and I probably would back Lefay, to be honest, over this period. As far as Anderson, we did talk about how his open play numbers maybe aren't good enough, and maybe I could change my mind after the Fulham match, but I still think he's kind of deserving of the price point that he's at and the sort of tier that he's at, regardless of whatever happens in that game. With Wilson, I mentioned that the main thing for me is his tick up in minutes is actually why I'm happy with keeping him as a green pick, even coming out of, let's say, last week's fixture for Burnley. And now, of course, he's going to face Nottingham Forest at home. We don't know what he's going to do there, but I still think I quite like him from the perspective of he's a set piece taker. Yeremy Pino, I still think I love. Underlyings still look good. There is an element to, he has good underlyings, but what has he actually done in FPL? And I think a lot of people can probably make that argument. Either way, though, these are still the two good games for this Crystal Palace team. I don't think Leeds away was a good game from an attacking point of view, but Tottenham at home and Fulham at home should be great games, and we can probably reassess how we feel about Yeremy Pino over these two matches. As far as Mount, he's actually become for sure an interesting option because Bruno coming out of this team is going to clearly have a detriment towards United. And I think to jump into the discussion, I would mention that more often than not in FPL, we do think, yes, of course, losing Bruno is absolutely catastrophic for the team. You've seen Ugarte play football. It's not pretty, but Casemiro will be back as well following his suspension. The pro for me is that other players do need to step up and will get better over this period, right? Someone will take penalties. Someone will take set pieces. Mount is most likely just going to stay on set pieces whilst Bruno is out. And to me, that's a huge pro for Mount. And his minutes also kind of need to tick up as well. So the previous con towards Mount is just, I think, his availability as a player. So the question mark around, how will Mount manage midweek fixtures? Like, will he suddenly be able to sort of play Wolves at home and give his all in that game? I'm not 100% sure, but I think with the good fixture run, with the good minutes uptick, and also the set piece boost, and him so far, I think going through these fixtures relatively unscathed, all leads to me as positive signs to why he should actually join the cheat sheet and be a top pick for now. With Tavernier, he gets a drop. We did talk about how he was exclusively almost a 1 week punt for Burnley at home. After that, I'm not super high on Bournemouth's fixtures and neither Tavernier's minutes, so he gets a drop. In the next few tiers, I'd probably want to just touch on Minte, Churkin, and Szoboszlai, because I think a lot of people will probably have different opinions on these players. What I would say, though, is with Minte, I do think that one-off substitution is still an early substitution that's less likely to happen because it's not like Brighton have that much depth on the right-hand side. That actually means, okay, Minte's, for example, in danger of getting benched within a certain match. I still think that's unlikely. But the reality is he just hasn't been that promising as of late. The underlying stats are more tilted towards assists than, let's say, the sort of XG. He does have some set piece share, but not much DEFCON share either. So with Arsenal away being a fixture in the distance, I think actually when you look at that, he's probably actually a really good buy in Gameweek 19. But can you actually guarantee great minutes for that game is the biggest question. So I think Minte is good where he's at in terms of that yellow tier, where there's going to be games where maybe suddenly he goes on a bit of a purple patch where he has a clean run of form, kind of like, for example, 5-6 game weeks ago, where he just plays 89 to 90 minutes a game, gets some set piece assists or just activity within the box and gets assists from that. But I think, yeah, the underlying stats don't suggest he's a freak of a player if he's going to have frail minutes sometimes. And I think you can't really legislate for that. Minte is more the type of player at this moment in time, in my opinion, whose minutes are mostly predicated by his own performance. So if he's playing poorly and Brighton play poorly, he will, I think, get subbed off because they kind of have the depth to replace him. And that's not necessarily the case for someone like Georgina Rutter, for example, where they just simply lack depth in the sort of positions that he plays. And he's the fittest player that can play in some of these positions because Welbeck, for example, is also struggling. With Sobo, as I said, going back to the Isak piece, if Isak is out, and the report, which I think was confirmed by David Ornstein, was actually that Isak's broken his leg. So we're talking couple months out here. And that's a couple months of Sobo on pens if Salah doesn't play, right? So all this kind of is probabilities of when does Salah come back, probabilities of what Salah's position is in the team. And maybe you don't like Sobo, from a right back perspective. But I think also now that he's suspended, it probably also means that he can get back to doing DEFCON things. Like his numbers were really good at the start of the season. And I think as soon as we saw him touch that 4 yellow card threshold, he was struggling immediately to sort of play good, considerable minutes. And I don't think the performance versus Tottenham was particularly exhilarating. It was quite poor, to be honest. But I don't see that necessarily as Sobo has to kind of come out of the cheat sheet or is a sell. I think he's a sell for people like myself who just needed a functional team for Game Week 18 and might be reconsidering him later. But at the same time, I think holding him could make sense if you actually have a pretty good squad, especially now with the context of the Bruno injury. The Bruno injury sort of redistributes funds towards the entire team. And someone like Sobo is, I think, in less of a precarious position as a result of this, right? So say you're spending the 1.2, 1.5 million that you get from Bruno, for example, somewhere else, you can now afford Sobo because instead of, let's say, shopping for a 5-point-X midfielder, you might be able to keep someone like Sobo in your team. So I think he is still an interesting option for me. Cherky, I think his minutes are always going to be predicated by his performances as well. So kind of going back to the Minte point, I think he's much more explosive than Minte, and you can see that from the underlying stats. So when we talk about how variable his minutes can be, I think it always comes down to his own performances. If you watch the West Ham game, he played himself off the pitch. So he turned over the ball many, many times. And I don't think we saw reactions from Pep from the match, but I could just hear even from the commentary that every time Turkey was turning the ball over, that you'd see or you'd hear the commentary say, Pep's falling to his knees, that sort of thing. And I think that kind of stuff clearly agitates Pep. But there's games where he plays faultlessly. And part of the reason why Cherky is green on the cheat sheet is because he can still do that over this run. And I think that a lot of the players, in the depth positions are still not good enough necessarily to sort of take away his minutes from the team. So players like Savinho, as an example. I'm happy to be wrong on this, but I still think Cherky's a very solid pick, and the underlying stats are still very much there. As you can see, even within that game, he got bonus. So that kind of just shows you how much threat he has. Like, he is still involved in actions, like the pre-assist, for example, for some of the goals. And yeah, I'm still very fond of Cherky as a pick. I would like to sort of reassess with Reinders as well over this period, but he's had so many stop and start kind of minutes in terms of having a start here, having a stop, having a benching here. So maybe we'll have Reinders back in the cheat sheet. I know season 1, episode 3 just came out, but we'll see. As far as the 7 million tier, no actual changes on this other than Semenyo gets a drop. I think this is just purely because Semenyo's fixture run is turning really, really poor soon. So when I kind of look at a player like Semenyo, I love owning Semenyo, and I'm going to own Semenyo for this week in Brentford away, but after that, it gets really poor. So it goes back to that sort of Morgan Rogers fixture run point where I would not want to own someone like Semenyo over those 2 games. I would not really want to own Rogers over those 2 games, despite him, doing great as of late. So with Rogers, I'm sure he's going to be someone who rises up the cheat sheet as soon as Nottingham Forest at home comes around. With Semenyo, it's just a case of after Chelsea and Arsenal, you probably would reconsider him. But even still, I think after those 2 games, the thing that makes him a bit worse compared to, let's say, maybe even a Rogers in the estimation of any other manager is that the fixture run after that is still sort of mediocre. So we'll see how it goes and see how these players continue to play. But I think Semenyo could continue to rise because everyone who's owned Bruno Fernandes in FPL is going to sell him more likely than not. And the reality is they're going to redistribute those funds into players who even have poor fixtures who have done well recently. So we're talking about players like Semenyo, talking about players like Rogers, and then also players like Cunha and Wirtz, who are, I think, fundamentally my favorite picks in terms of replacing, let's say, potentially a Bruno. I'll talk about Wirtz in a moment as to why he's not green. I just don't think he really deserves it. I've argued with a couple managers already, but I'm happy to share my thoughts. For Sade, he actually had really good underlying stats for the previous match, playing versus Wolves, and to me, he still looks like a much more lively player than Thiago. Save for when Thiago gets penalties and people like FPL points. But yeah, I think Sade had like 0.59 XGI from that game. I was actually watching that match alongside the City game at the time, and he was just simply able to get shots into positions. He was actually running onto balls. I think Sade is actually still probably one of the good picks over this run. Sure, he hasn't delivered on points, but he was also suspended in the previous match. So I think let's see how he does versus Bournemouth at home, Tottenham at home. These are 2 exceptional games, and we can kind of reconsider. Either way, he's obviously going to drop post these 2 games. But as someone who's moved into Sade or looking into Sade, I still think the logic is still very much there because the underlyings are still decent. For Cunha, I think he just benefits from Bruno's absence, even in spite of United getting worse as a team. I think part of it is you must sort of imply that Cunha probably has a bit of pen share. I do think Sesko's absolutely impeccable record. I think he's 11-0. Suggests that Sesko should deserve the chance to take, but his minutes are also not going to be perfect over this run. I just don't think we'll see him play sort of full 90s. That's impossible because he's also not playing particularly well. But for someone like Cunha, if you kind of just describe, Mbeumo being out, Bruno being out for the short term, surely he's the main man. Surely he takes penalties. There's also Mount around, of course, who's taking set pieces now. But yeah, I think Cunha just generally benefits even with Bruno coming out, despite the team being fundamentally worse. And that's because the fixture run is still good enough, and his underlying stats have held up. And even in the short half versus Aston Villa, they were still getting pretty good chances versus that Villa team away from home. Now you actually have a much cleaner fixture run with better home games and even easier away games. So we'll see how Cunha does, but I still think he's a top pick. With Rice, I feel a bit bad about dropping him, and then suddenly he drops a masterclass. I still think that that's the case, mostly because I still like Saka a lot. And obviously Saka's dropped another blank, but and not even taking penalties, so maybe Saka deserves a yellow. I was actually going to make Saka yellow too this week, but then I actually thought with the Bruno injury, is there so much pressure on Saka to drop in FPL? That was kind of my main thought. I think in a game where you kind of need to think about how people are invested into triple Arsenal, I would say that anyone who owns a structure that's probably something like Rice plus 2 defenders, Rice is technically a green pick in FPL. The only situation where I kind of see Rice as more being yellow is I think a lot of people do own double defense. And then I think that sort of question of, do you own Rice or Saka? I'm someone who's leaning towards Saka, but clearly I've been on the wrong end of things as of late, and someone can completely disagree. So we'll see how that goes going forwards. But yeah, fundamentally, I think with more money in the game because of Bruno's injury, I would probably keep Saka over Rice. And that's kind of the illustration here because Triple Arsenal is such a constant theme within teams. As far as Gordon, I'm kind of hesitant to give him a rise because I do think that you do need to be realistic with the minutes that people will play over this run. With Newcastle almost having depth for every single position that they have on the pitch, it's more likely that you'll see players like Barnes, Elanga, and Wisa just play more minutes over this run and maybe even start, the alternative game. I mean, the whole point of having depth in the team is that. I do think Eddie Howe likes utilizing that depth. And unfortunately, I think Gordon will sort of struggle from that. Obviously, being a penalty taker is absolutely massive. That's why he's always been yellow, even though the minutes that he has compared to some of the other players on this list are much worse. But yeah, that's kind of the main con going for him right now, where I think with midweek fixtures, he stands to struggle the most. Over the next few picks here, I would say with Bruno G, I still don't look at United away as being a particularly great game. So maybe we can reconsider, whether he gets a rise as well as soon as Burnley comes around. But I'm still not that high on him, mostly because, as I said, even though he has a lot of routes towards points, it's more like he is still not that great at any of those particular routes, other than his goal scoring has definitely upticked a little bit recently with the NPXG coming up. With Wirtz, he's been added as an option. I talked about him in terms of Bruno replacements. I think the key thing here with Wirtz is that these are two wonderful fixtures, and he finally got an assist. I still have to say though, when you actually benchmark Wirtz across all of the midfielders in this game here, and you look at the underlying stats, these are poor numbers. Like there's absolutely no getting around that. The value is purely Wolves at home, Leeds at home. I don't see any other reason why you'd own Wirtz. And that's kind of my problem. I just think, okay, there's one match here where maybe Wirtz I think gets a fair bit of set piece share versus Wolves. So he's more akin to someone who you'd want to own, for example, in a free hit situation, as opposed to someone you really want to own, at least even the medium to long term. So I see Wirtz as maybe someone who definitely gets sold in Game Week 20, as opposed to someone that you want to own for a long time. Whereas with Cunha, I think the value towards him as a pick is that United's fixture run is quite extended, similar to Liverpool's towards an extent. But I think I'd be much more comfortable owning Cunha just with the baselines that he's set as a player. With Wirtz, the problem for me is once Sobo comes back into this team, you're going to lose the set piece share again, and you're going to lose that sort of creativity in terms of if you look at Sobo and the kind of chances he can get from set pieces from the right back position, he's still got something like 0.24 XA versus Tottenham. And the key thing for me with Wirtz is that haul pretty much comes out of Tottenham making a mistake. It's not like he is suddenly picking apart defenses. He is almost like leveling up in the Premier League. I'm not sure I'm really seeing that. If people disagree, that's fine. I just think personally, I don't think Wirtz has dramatically changed as a pick from Game Week 1 and all the fixtures that we've seen since until this recent Tottenham game where he finally got involved. Sure, he's been close to getting involved, as has many other players in FPL, but that's kind of why underlying stats are good as an objective measure to kind of say, what has he actually done so far? And I'm not even looking at his output. I'm just saying 0.32 for someone at this price point is quite mediocre. And I don't like the idea that beyond Wolves at home, he has additional intangibles because he doesn't. So with, let's say, Bruno, unfortunately, that's Bruno out of the cheat sheet for now. I think a few games means that he's gone for a bit. I've kept him here just in case, he might come back. And maybe, let's say, scans suggest that Bruno's injury is much better than expected. But I don't think the news really implies that he's going to be back in the next 2 games. And I think if you miss Wolves at home, that's more than enough for Bruno to go as an FPL pick. With Saka, for the reasons that I've sort of explained, I've still kept him green. That's mostly because of the Bruno injury. With Palmer, I think the concern is how is he fitness-wise? He obviously is an incredible player. That's not changed at all. He's been incredibly involved since he's come back to sort of playing football in the Premier League, and I think he's gotten a return every single game. But the minutes are still a problem, and you're about to jump into midweek fixtures where he's been protected from them. So he's kind of doing a shift now of like 50 to 70 to 80 minutes a game. starting one match a week, and you're about to jump into a period where you're suddenly playing, 4 or 5 fixtures in a row with no rest. And maybe they can optimize it where he plays 4 out of 5 of the next Premier League games. But I still think that at this sort of price point, you don't really want a player who misses out a game or misses out a start, right? So coming off the bench, I don't think is good enough, but I could be wrong. So that's up to you. Palmer clearly, the fixture run, you could arguably say starts now, but I think I'd probably still ignore him for the time being from a minutes perspective. In the forward position, I've not made too many changes. I'm pretty proud of moving Calvert-Lewin into the green ahead of that sort of set piece brace. Funnily enough, I saw a chart of all of Calvert-Lewin's goals this season, and it's literally in a straight line. It was basically just directly in front of the box. So it just kind of reminded me of the instruction in FPL of like staying central or something like that. But yeah, I mean, he's had a great season, a positive finishing season. Would you believe that? And this is kind of what I talk about with a lot of the videos that we make, where sometimes when people react to the finishing, they just think this is going to keep happening over and over again. And sure, over the life of his career, Dominic Calvert-Lewin has been a negative finisher, but right now he's a positive finisher. And it can just show you that you don't have to be so tied into beliefs that players are so fundamentally bad or so fundamentally good, because things can very easily change seasonally between players. And I think to an extent, even Morgan Rogers is kind of representing this because he is a growing player. He's having a breakout season in terms of the long shots. Like, this is basically going to end up one of the greatest positive finishing seasons ever if Rodgers sort of maintains the rate that he's at. But it's not like last season he showed any signs of being, the best finisher in the Premier League in terms of like that sort of Son or Kane or even like Odegaard type or Foden type seasons where they just had, +7 to +10 goals compared to their XG. So let's see what Rodgers ends up doing this season, but he's obviously having like a re-breakout of sorts, and Calvert-Lewin is himself reversing some trends of his own past. With Welbeck, he gets a drop because, yeah, I mean, you can't trust this guy, unfortunately. And we're about to head into more midweek fixtures. I actually thought at the time of recording the cheat sheet the previous week that he'd be ready for Sunderland at home. But then we actually got a lot of reporting suggesting that, even from Fabian Hertzler's press conference, that he was not even available for, full parts of team training. So that's why we kind of thought that he would be benched for the Sunderland home game. And that's sometimes the value, I think, if you kind of are, on the deadline streams, or if you're on football Twitter, sometimes you do get a lot of information on the Friday. You do get some managers who choose to give you information. You do also get people who are fans of teams sharing information about Brighton as well. So, yeah, I think unfortunately Welbeck, from a minutes perspective, just drops. Bowen, I've actually given a rise. João Pedro and Moltemade have given rises as well. Part of the reason why I've not given Thiago a fall is because I think with Bruno gone, once again, you have more money in FPL. And I think the biggest thing for Thiago, kind of like the Sade point, is these are two absolutely exquisite games. Can I really say that Thiago is that bad of an FPL pick? Sure, he's been bad for the last 2 matches, but it's not like we thought he was suddenly, or suddenly Thiago has become a completely different player because Dango Utara doesn't play football. So I do think a lot of, for example, the goals that he scored are also non-pen goals, right? He still has, some of the most pens in the Premier League, but he was capable of scoring non-pen goals. He will still be capable of scoring non-pen goals. I don't think the argument has changed there. I think for most managers, you give him Bournemouth and Tottenham. Otherwise, of course, you can just do simple moves like, Bruno out into someone else, move Thiago into Ekitike. And I think whilst Ekitike looks like that shiny new toy, I don't want to be dismissive of the idea that actually keeping Thiago is perfectly fine and very sensible FPL. Bowen gets a rise because the fixture run for West Ham is much better. Underlying stats are starting to tick up a bit as well, so that's something we want to sort of monitor as a trend with this West Ham team. Have they turned a page, generally speaking, from attack, where Bowen was kind of, unfortunately, just sort of ancillary, and now, for example, has clearly sort of gone into the thick of things, and he's overperformed a bit this season, but, I mean, why not have an overperform on your team? With João Pedro and Moltemade, their underlying stats are actually pretty decent, and their minutes so far have looked decent. I think with Moltemade, I probably was a bit harsh sort of making him an orange pick. I don't think he's like Welbeck tier per se, so I think that's harsh. Wissa is back though, and I think that's going to be the problem, right? Does he start all of these games? Probably not. So whilst I'm giving him a rise just to sort of, I guess, respect him as a pick, I don't think necessarily I'm in love with, buying Moltemade anytime soon. I think part of it is just a lot of the price points are changing very quickly in FPL. So suddenly Waltemad at a 7.2 or 7.1 price point is a little bit more interesting than he was a couple of weeks ago when he was close to 7.5, and that's kind of how the needle shifts sometimes in FPL. Where I would maybe feel a little bit differently about Ekitike if he was suddenly like a 9.8 million pick, and things like that. So Bowen for me gets a rise. João Pedro gets a rise because I think the minutes just look really good, and he's played pretty well as of late. So I probably was a bit too harsh on his minutes. In the meantime, with Mateta, I think Tottenham and Fulham are really good. So kind of similar towards the Thiago situation, where if you've actually held him all this time somehow, sure, I think Ekitike is actually such a simple transfer to make. But if you want to hold him for whatever reason, or you're like 3-4-3, and you suddenly own, let's say, Thiago plus, let's say, Ekitike and Haaland, like that's a very good team. That's not a team that I would be dismissive of. So that's kind of how I feel about that template there. In terms of defense, shifting over to that, not too many changes. I think we're in a phase in FPL where, because 4.5s are so strong, rotation is strong. So once again, it comes down to if you have the right rotation every week to week where you're fielding 3 players or 4 players on defense, and you actually have it optimized where you, generally speaking, have a decent game, or at least a good def corner within a certain match where you can see him getting def con, maybe not getting, for example, completely demolished like Crystal Palace did with set pieces. A lot of these defenders can be good even though the fixture run doesn't look perfect because you're just rotating in and out. So the way that I'm setting this up is Goodmanson gets added to the cheat sheet because he's actually just an option where if people are looking at, let's say, saving as much money as possible, and maybe in the defense position, like previously we had Estev who's now injured, technically I think Klein and Goodmanson do play football every single match, and they can give you some value within the game. With Mukiele and Alderete, I think they're still my favorite options, to be quite honest, like, and just to spend a little bit more money on. But you don't need to necessarily do that. In the next tier, still love Brentford because I think the 2 games are good. So that's why we were comfortable with giving Collins a rise last week, and I'm pretty happy they kept a clean sheet. Although it was a bit of a fortunate clean sheet as well, with Kelleher making a penalty save on what was an absolutely diabolical shot or attempt at taking a penalty from Strand Larsen, but it is what it is. Lewis Potter, I think, is an exceptional pick that a lot of people can look at. My concern is still, like, if you kind of look at the performance, and I think, to be honest, a brace will completely change the narrative. So I think Lewis Potter is, firmly back as an FPL pick. But I think part of it, too, is you kind of want a defender to be a bit more of a long-term pick, and I'm not sure if Lewis Potter's minutes are going to be perfect. So I think he deserves to be on the cheat sheet, but I'm not sure if he's as stable a pick, for example, as a Collins or a Vandenberg going forwards. But I think definitely he's the type of pick you want to see on a free hit. So yeah, going back to the point here, I think a lot of the stable picks that we have here are just good def connors, and that's kind of the name of the game, to be honest. Anderson, Keane, Richards, Collins. Dallo, he is open play value, so I think if you can optimize around like fixtures like Wolves at home, he can serve a purpose for you with Van Heck. I think it was just illness, so it seems like he could be back soon. I wouldn't drop him too hard because, as I said, I already dropped him last week. I don't think I necessarily need to drop him again. Cash is still playing for a very, very solid team. Maybe he could be an orange pick as well because Villa's next 2 games are tough. But I'm also thinking at the end of the day, you're not owning Cash, and you never were planning to own Cash for Chelsea and Arsenal. So it's just about, generally speaking, coming out of those fixtures, is he a pretty good hold? I think so. Senesi, to me, gets a drop though because I think the fixtures are very, very rough. And honestly, the underlying stats, continue to skid for a team like Bournemouth. At some point in the game versus Burnley, they actually had only conceded 0 XGC. So I don't think, for example, that Burnley game has suddenly like scarred my mind, kind of like in the way that I think probably last week I was overreactive towards the Fulham match, although I still haven't watched Fulham versus 94, so we'll see what happens there. But kind of my point is to say that Bournemouth have been very much a home and away team, and right now the fixtures are just very, very poor, where all the good games that they kind of have on paper are still very, very tough opponents, and I don't think I'd really back Senesi over this run. As far as the next tier, Hincapié just is going to be a green option until he stops playing football, basically, vis-a-vis, I guess, Gabriel coming back. Guehi, O'Reilly, Nunez, Tarkowski I still quite like. Sure, a lot of people are going to react towards this Crystal Palace performance, and they're just going to say, I'm happy to sell these Crystal Palace defenders now. But I don't think that, I think that game is kind of a blip in the grand scheme of things. No one overreacted, for example, to Leeds scoring 3 goals versus Chelsea and said that Chelsea's defense is suddenly toilet. In much the same way that I would react to this game as well, another Leeds away match where I would not react to that situation in the same way with Crystal Palace defenders. They have been a very solid defense all season long. They're very good at DEFCON, and they clearly have a lot of threats in the team still. The problem, of course, is going to be, are we finally starting to see the impacts of this team playing too many minutes, this team having a significant lack of depth, and what will happen in the January window with this team? But I don't really want to overreact on Crystal Palace yet, so players like Guehi are still going to be top options for me. Tarkowski and Tuchel get rises. However, Tarkowski is on 4 yellow cards, so just a little bit of an asterisk here. Where, look, I think unfortunately, if let's say you suddenly bought Tarkowski for this game and he gets suspended over the next two, that's not ideal, because I think both Nottingham Forest away and Brentford at home are wonderful games to own Tarkowski for. So that's just the slight con from that match. I think even collectively versus Arsenal, they were generally quite solid. We clearly know that they've lost a lot of attacking options, so that's kind of why I've been pretty cold in terms of appreciating the Everton attack. But I think the defense is still, all systems go for the most part in FPL. Tuchel for me gets a rise. I think he's just still a very, very solid pick in the game and has proven to be just an excellent def corner too. So, yeah, I think Newcastle actually have a pretty good run coming up again soon. I wouldn't say now, because I think after United away is when the run starts, but we can sort of react to that in a moment. After that, maybe just to touch on, for example, Liverpool, on Arsenal, and City, just because that's kind of the remaining picks, right? I think from a Chelsea perspective, you probably want to look at them, as I said, for when some of the tougher fixtures come round towards an end. So I'd say target them after Man City away. Bournemouth at home is an exceptional game, though. I won't dismiss that. Aston Villa at home, probably looking a little bit worse now, just because Aston Villa have just proven to be such a capable team. But yeah, I think Bournemouth at home is a great game. Otherwise, I'm not so intrigued about Chelsea for the short term. For a team like Liverpool, though, obviously they have got a much cleaner fixture run. Konate's DEFCON numbers are actually very close now to Virgil, and his minutes are very close to Virgil as well. So I think I'd be very comfortable owning Konate over Virgil. And I think this is the type of FPL season where you can say, for more times than not, the cheaper defender in certain teams, specifically the center back option, has proven to be very good, unless there's a dramatic gap in DEFCON, right? So what I'm going to talk about in terms of dramatic gap in DEFCON, I think that's Senesi versus Diakite as an example. But if you look at Hinkapie, much better than Saliba, his partner, which is why Saliba's a yellow pick and Hinkapie is a green. With Virgil and Konate, my only pro or con, sorry, in some cases, Konate does get subbed off in certain instances, and Virgil at the end of the day, I think is a larger set piece to that. Although the XGI within the Premier League this season actually suggests Konate has actually gotten a couple set pieces so far. I do think Virgil is still the main target of the set pieces, though, if you're just watching the games and watching how the set pieces are orchestrated. So I don't think I would say Konate is a better set piece option. Calafiori is still Calafiori. I think that the sort of argument or argument against someone like Calafiori is always going to be around minutes, right? So if you look at someone like him, the question is going to be, does Marcelo Skelly play minutes and take too many minutes away from him? I still don't really think that's the case. So I wouldn't overreact too much about that. I think Calafiori is still an absolutely exceptional pick. Yes, as of late, Hinkapie has outscored players like Calafiori and Timber, but I don't think that that's going to be the status quo going forwards. I still think Timber is wonderful. I still think Calafiori is wonderful, and all these options are very, very good. Same thing with the Arsenal defense as a whole, where even though the fixture run is slightly worse than teams like Liverpool and City, the main thing that creates this gap is their defense is just inherently better, and the underlying stats do back that up. As far as City picks, though, they're still in the midst of that run, so that's why they're still all great options, and I don't really have any sort of immediate change in thoughts in terms of an O'Reilly or a Nunez or a Guardiola. I think they're all fantastic. So that's kind of my defense recap. As far as the goalkeepers here, no actual changes this week. I just can't really see why I justify making a change at all. Pretty happy with where the goalkeepers are all tiered. Nice to see Verbruggen and Kelleher doing well. These are both picks I think a lot of people actually didn't have much faith in a couple weeks ago, and I think Brighton have gotten a lot of clean since then. Brentford probably quite fortunate to get a clean this week. I think maybe let's see how they manage as a team going forwards, but when you have a good fixture on, I guess you also sometimes get luckier clean sheets or luckier chances to get clean sheets. So that's all I feel about the cheat sheet for now. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys soon with the next video. Take care. Goodbye.